The Galactic Academy was a prestigious institution, home to the brightest and most intellectually advanced species across the universe. Alien students from all corners of the galaxy flocked here, eager to learn from the best professors and to refine their knowledge in diplomacy, strategy, and intergalactic relations. The Academy prided itself on creating peacekeepers, leaders, and scholars who could build bridges between worlds. Yet, in a classroom far from the calm halls of high intellect, one human student stood out in the most unexpected way. Ethan McAllister, a young human from Earth, had always struggled with his place at the Academy. While his intelligence and adaptability were on par with his alien peers, humanity's chaotic and war-torn history made him an outcast in a place where diplomacy and logic reigned supreme. He was from a species that had fought wars for survival, not political gain. Earth's reputation was marred by its violent past, and it left Ethan constantly battling prejudice in every lesson. Professor Zion Azareth was an esteemed instructor of diplomacy at the Academy. He was known for his sharp intellect and calm demeanor, believing that peace could only be achieved through reason and understanding. But today his perception of humans, and Ethan in particular, would be challenged in a way he could never have anticipated. What began as a simple lecture on diplomacy would soon become a powerful lesson on the true nature of humanity and survival itself. The Galactic Academy was a place where species from countless worlds gathered to learn the art of diplomacy and intergalactic cooperation. Students here were carefully selected, each representing the pinnacle of their respective societies. The Academy's mission was clear: foster peace, understanding, and collaboration across the stars. Professors like Zion Azareth were revered for their ability to negotiate, resolve conflicts, and guide the galaxy's brightest minds toward a future of peace. But what happened when the classroom became the battleground, and the mind was outmatched by raw, untamed instinct? Ethan McAllister, human, earthborn, and the son of a war-torn planet, was not like the other students. He stood out not only because of his humanity, but because of what humanity represented: a species that had fought tooth and nail for survival, not always with words, but with action. Ethan's home planet had seen its share of conflicts. Earth had endured wars that had shaped its history in blood, yet humanity had persisted. Survival was not a mere concept for humans. It was an instinct, honed by years of adversity. This background was something many of the Academy students, and certainly its professors, found difficult to understand. To them, humans were primitive, driven by emotion and instinct rather than intellect and strategy. Professor Zion, a revered academic, was no exception to this stereotype. To him, humanity's violent past was a testament to their lack of true understanding, a mark of weakness in the realm of diplomacy. He had taught hundreds of species that true power came from intellect, from negotiation, from peaceful resolution of conflicts. He had never once considered that survival, true physical survival, could be a form of diplomacy. Zion's views had been shaped by his upbringing on the Zareth homeworld, where warfare was all but non-existent. The Zareth prided themselves on their ability to resolve conflicts through rational discourse and negotiation. Their society, devoid of war for centuries, had mastered the art of diplomacy. This perspective led them to look down upon species that still fought for survival or had a history of violent conquest. The Zareth were accustomed to peace, and to them, humanity's chaotic history was a sign of failure, not strength. Yet, as the class began, Zion found himself faced with a challenge unlike any he had encountered before. Ethan had proven himself an intelligent student, capable of understanding complex diplomatic principles. Yet the professor often found himself dismissing the young human's insights, believing them to be based on outdated human concepts. The final straw came during one particularly heated discussion on the nature of conflict and the value of negotiation. Zion, ever the intellectual, had asserted that only those with the wisdom to negotiate without violence truly understand the art of peace. His lecture had been full of ideals that praised peaceful resolution, emphasizing that true power lay in the ability to make others bend to your will without a single blow being struck. Ethan, however, found himself growing restless. The words were laced with a disdain for what Xian deemed primitive solutions, and they struck a nerve. Unable to contain himself, Ethan spoke up. "Professor, I disagree. You're talking about a peace that's only possible in a world without chaos. What about the rest of the universe? The parts where survival isn't just about diplomacy, but about fighting for every breath." His voice was calm, but there was an edge of conviction that caught the class's attention. Xian turned to him, his multi-limbed body still and rigid. "What are you suggesting, McAllister? That humanity's chaotic history somehow makes you better suited for diplomacy than those of us who have mastered the art of peace?" Ethan's eyes burned with a quiet fire. "I'm not suggesting we're better," he replied, his voice steady but piercing. "I'm saying we've earned our survival in ways you'll never understand. Diplomacy might work in a place like Zareth, where peace is taken for granted. But for us humans, peace isn't something we were given. We had to fight for it with every ounce of strength we had." A ripple of tension spread through the room. The other students, a collection of various species, began to murmur among themselves. Some seemed curious, others skeptical, and a few even amused by the boldness of a human challenging one of the galaxy's most respected professors. Xian's expression remained cold, but there was a flicker of something more in his eyes, a challenge, a recognition that Ethan's words carried more weight than he was willing to admit. "You speak of survival, McAllister, but there is no place for violence in true diplomacy. True strength is the ability to solve conflicts without bloodshed." Ethan stood up, feeling the weight of the class's gaze on him. "I'm not saying violence is the solution, but you're wrong if you think it's always avoidable. Sometimes, the only way to ensure peace is to prove you can survive without it." The class fell into a stunned silence. Xian, though still composed, now found himself in a position where his academic intellect was being challenged not by reason, but by something far more primal. The irony was not lost on Ethan. Here was a professor, a master of peace, being confronted by the very thing he had discounted as inferior: human survival. In this pivotal moment, the tension between Ethan and Professor Xian had reached a boiling point. Both had their definitions of strength and peace, but it was becoming increasingly clear that survival, the ability to endure and rise against overwhelming odds, was something Xian had yet to truly comprehend. The challenge had been laid bare. Humanity's survival instincts were more than just an answer to adversity. They were a core element of human strength, something that could not be ignored in a galaxy where peace was often a fragile illusion. Xian, for all his wisdom and years of experience, had just learned that humanity's strength didn't lie in diplomacy alone. It lay in the courage to face the worst and rise to meet it, something no amount of intellectual negotiation could teach. The atmosphere in the classroom was thick with tension. Ethan McAllister stood across from Professor Xian, his heart pounding, his grip tightening on the desk in front of him. The alien students, a mix of species, shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking between the human and their revered professor. No one dared to speak as Xian's sharp, calculating eyes locked with Ethan's. The moment had been building ever since Ethan's challenge during the lecture on diplomacy. Ethan, who had always been quiet and reserved in class, had finally had enough. The insult to humanity's strength, to Earth's history of survival, had reached a breaking point. Professor Xian, with his deep knowledge of diplomacy, had always dismissed the human's emotions and instinctive responses as primitive and outdated. The professor's confidence was undeniable, rooted in centuries of intellectual superiority, while Ethan's strength lay not in debate, but in something far more primal, something that Xian had never fully understood. As the professor had arrogantly claimed that violence was never the answer to resolving conflict, Ethan's frustration finally broke free. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "You've never had to fight just to stay alive. Your people have never known what it's like to struggle for every single breath. You think peace is easy, but it's not. It's earned. It's fought for." Xian tilted his head slightly, his expression amused but dismissive. "I've heard enough of your primitive ramblings, McAllister. I've seen what humans do when pushed too far, and it's always the same: violence and bloodshed. But in this academy, we aim for something higher than brute force. Ethan's jaw clenched. The insult was the final straw. The disrespect that Xian had shown towards humans for weeks, the subtle mockery, now became too much to bear. His hands balled into fists as the adrenaline surged through his veins. His instincts were already taking over, the instincts of a Deathworlder, a human from Earth, a planet where survival wasn't just a matter of intellect, but of sheer will and force. Without warning, Ethan stood from his seat, the metal chair scraping against the floor with an audible screech. Every eye in the room shifted toward him, some in fear, others in anticipation. The space between him and Xian felt infinite, but Ethan's movements were fluid, almost instinctual, as if his body knew what had to be done. Xian raised an eyebrow, the amusement in his gaze faltering, replaced by a hint of disbelief. "What are you doing, McAllister?" he asked, his voice cold and condescending. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, his hands moved to his side and retrieved a small blade, a ceremonial sword from Earth, forged from the deepest corners of his culture. The sword was not one of brutal war, but of honor and survival, symbols of Earth's violent past, now held in a human's grasp as a reminder of what humanity had to endure. The entire class seemed to hold their breath as Ethan drew the sword, the blade catching the soft light of the classroom. For a moment, all that could be heard was the hum of the advanced technology surrounding them, the holographic projections, and the glowing interfaces of alien textbooks. Ethan's grip tightened on the hilt of the sword, his body suddenly taut with the awareness of what was about to happen. Xian's posture shifted from casual to defensive. His multi-limbed body relaxed just slightly, preparing for whatever Ethan might do. The professor, still not fully realizing the weight of his words, spoke again, more cautiously now. "You're playing a dangerous game, McAllister. You've never faced a true adversary like me." But Ethan didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked on Xian, his expression now as hard as the blade in his hand. "You don't get it," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of the Earth's history. "This isn't about victory. This is about proving that we don't back down. Not now, not ever." With that, Ethan stepped forward. The moment the blade came into motion, Professor Xian felt a wave of hesitation. He had been ready for verbal sparring, not this, human instinct, raw and untamed. The Galactic classroom, once a symbol of intellect and control, had been turned into a dangerous arena. Ethan wasn't just fighting back against an arrogant professor. He was fighting for humanity's dignity, for the right to be seen as more than a species of brutal, impulsive beings. He wasn't just challenging Xian's words. He was challenging the entire notion that humanity's way of life could be dismissed. The next few seconds stretched out in slow motion as Xian's mind raced to adapt. The alien professor was used to thinking his way through challenges. But facing a human's instinctive power was a different matter altogether. Ethan was no longer just a student. He was the embodiment of human resilience, and Xian's self-assurance began to crack. Ethan had drawn the line, and the professor would soon learn that to underestimate humanity's strength was a fatal mistake. The air in the classroom felt heavier as Ethan McAllister, his sword drawn and his expression calm, faced Professor Xian. The tension in the room was palpable, with the entire class of alien students frozen in place, watching in stunned silence. What was supposed to be a lecture on diplomacy had now become a confrontation that none of them had anticipated. No one in the room, especially Xian, understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Ethan's hand gripped the hilt of the ceremonial sword with surprising ease, the weight of it familiar, though the atmosphere around him was anything but. The blade wasn't large, no, it was not a weapon of conquest, but it was sharp, expertly forged, and a symbol of the human spirit. It was a weapon of survival, of resilience. And in this moment, it was the only thing that stood between the professor's pride and the human student's dignity. Xian's initial shock quickly gave way to a defensive posture, his alien form subtly shifting. Despite his apparent confidence in intellect, the professor had never encountered someone quite like Ethan. The Xerath were masters of negotiation, of restraint, but in the presence of someone who knew nothing but fight or flight, the rules of engagement changed. This wasn't a contest of words, but of raw survival. With a flick of his wrist, Ethan took a step forward, his movements smooth but deliberate. Xian instinctively raised his arms, projecting a barrier of energy, his defensive shields activating. The Xerath species was not known for physical prowess, but for their ability to use energy manipulation as a defense. The shimmering, translucent barrier was a safety net designed to neutralize threats without engaging in physical confrontation. But Ethan's approach was not one Xian had ever considered. He had read countless books on alien combat strategies, but human unpredictability was an unknown variable. Ethan's first strike came fast, too fast for Xian to process. The sword moved with precision, cutting through the air, its tip aimed for Xian's midsection. The energy shield sparked violently, absorbing the impact, but Xian could feel the force of the strike reverberate through his barrier. The professor took a step back, his body retreating as he focused his energy on strengthening the shield, his mind working furiously to maintain control. Is this really what humans resort to, McAllister? A petty fight? Xian sneered, his voice tight with frustration. But Ethan did not answer in words. Instead, he pressed forward, his sword striking with calculated speed, aiming to break through the energy shield. The swiftness of his movements caught Xian off guard. Ethan was fighting with a combination of skill, agility, and something much more elemental: the desire to prove that humans could survive, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Xian raised a second shield in an attempt to block Ethan's strike, but the human student was already ahead of him. Ethan shifted his stance, stepping to the side and ducking under a rising shield, delivering a horizontal swipe with his sword that hit the outer edge of the professor's defense, sending a ripple of energy through the barrier. Xian staggered slightly, momentarily off balance, as the shields flickered. He had never encountered a student who fought with such intensity, who adapted to every move he made with such speed and instinct. It wasn't about power or force, it was about reaction and adaptability. For a moment, Xian felt something he had never experienced: vulnerability. Enough, Xian commanded, raising his arms to generate a larger barrier, hoping to incapacitate Ethan without further escalation. But Ethan wasn't listening. In that crucial moment, Ethan saw through the shield's flaw, a momentary weakness, when the barriers clashed. Seizing the opportunity, Ethan launched himself at the professor, closing the distance between them with a burst of speed. The energy shield cracked as Ethan struck with the sword, not to injure, but to disrupt. The attack was not about overpowering Xian, but about breaking the professor's false sense of superiority. With a sharp flick of his wrist, Ethan redirected the shield's energy, forcing it to collapse in on itself. Xian's eyes widened in disbelief as his shield fizzled out of existence, leaving him exposed for the briefest of moments. The momentum shifted. Ethan didn't strike with the sword. Instead, he stepped back, his expression cold but not hostile. He wasn't here to kill, to maim, or to win a victory in blood. His aim was beyond combat. It was to show the professor that humanity's true strength wasn't in physical might, but in the will to survive. Xian, disoriented and now vulnerable, understood the gravity of the situation. The fight wasn't just a display of strength. It was a statement about humanity's place in the galaxy, about how far a human could go when pushed to the brink. The alien professor steadied himself, panting. The fight had ended, but a new understanding had begun to form. Ethan had proven something far more important than victory. He had demonstrated the true nature of humanity's resilience. For a long moment, neither of them moved, but Xian's earlier arrogance had vanished. He wasn't just an educator anymore. He was a witness to something he had misjudged completely: humanity's ability to fight, survive, and adapt. The power to endure even when logic and reason failed was a strength that Xian could no longer deny. The fight had tested both of them in ways they hadn't expected. And as the classroom fell silent, it was clear that this lesson would be the one they would all remember. The atmosphere in the classroom was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of the confrontation. The once sterile environment, filled with glowing holograms and sleek metallic surfaces, now seemed to pulse with the remnants of conflict. The energy in the room was raw, a stark contrast to the structured learning space it had been only moments before. Ethan McAllister stood, his sword still in hand, the glowing blade a reminder of the power of human instincts. Professor Xian, now stunned and shaken, stood across from him, disoriented by the rapid turn of events. Ethan had never intended to kill or seriously harm the professor. But the moment had come to teach Xian a lesson, one that he could never have learned through books or lectures. Humanity's strength didn't come from superior intellect or advanced technology. It came from the primal will to survive, adapt, and overcome. That was the lesson Ethan had just delivered in the most direct and striking way possible. Professor Xian had made a grave mistake. He had misjudged Ethan and, by extension, all of humanity. In his arrogance, he believed that intelligence and reason were the only true forms of power in the galaxy. His species, the Zareth, had lived in peace for centuries. Their society had thrived without war or conflict, relying on intellect and diplomacy to navigate the galaxy's complexities. To Xian, humans were nothing more than a chaotic species, unable to rise to the level of galactic peacekeepers. The professor had underestimated the sheer force of human will, which had been forged in the crucible of Earth's harsh history. He had failed to recognize that survival, for humanity, was not just a matter of intelligence, but of an unyielding determination to push forward, no matter the odds. As the dust settled in the classroom, Xian realized the weight of his miscalculation. The shields he had erected were not enough to protect him from the fierce willpower of a Deathworlder. He had thought his superior intellect could easily overpower Ethan's emotional response, that the human would falter in the face of reason. But Ethan hadn't faltered. Instead, he had shown that reason and instinct could coexist, and when combined, they created a formidable force. For a moment, there was silence. Xian stood with his back slightly arched, the weight of his own hubris pressing down on him. He looked at Ethan, who remained unmoved, standing tall with a quiet confidence. Ethan's calmness was unsettling. Unlike many of the aliens in the room who were trained to keep their emotions in check, Ethan's actions were driven by something deeper, something that transcended reason. Professor Xian, Ethan finally spoke, his voice steady, cutting through the silence. You speak of peace and diplomacy, but you forget that not every conflict can be resolved with words. Sometimes, survival is the only answer. Xian's chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, his mind racing as the words sank in. He had always prided himself on being a master of diplomacy, a being who could solve any problem with intellect and calm negotiation. He had dismissed humanity as primitive and impulsive, convinced that their history of war and violence made them unworthy of the same respect that more advanced species received. But now, in the face of Ethan's unyielding determination, Xian saw the flaw in his thinking. It wasn't just intellect that made a species strong. It was the ability to adapt to an ever-changing and often hostile environment. Humanity's history of conflict had shaped them in ways Xian could never have anticipated. They had learned to fight, to endure, to survive in the face of overwhelming adversity. Ethan's movement was deliberate, measured, and precise. The way he handled the sword spoke volumes about his nature. It wasn't a display of brute strength or mindless aggression, but a quiet confidence rooted in the understanding that survival was both an art and a necessity. It was something that Xian, with all his years of education and intellect, had failed to grasp. You've seen it for yourself, Professor, Ethan continued, his eyes never leaving Xian's face. Survival isn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It's about knowing when to act, when to hold your ground, and when to push forward, even when the world seems against you. For a brief moment, Xian wanted to argue. He wanted to retort that intellect would always triumph over force, that words would always be the better weapon. But as he stood there, facing the human student who had just humiliated him in front of his peers, he could no longer cling to that belief. Ethan hadn't used brute force to overwhelm him. He had used something far more potent, his understanding of the struggle for survival, a survival that Xian could not truly comprehend. Xian's mind raced, trying to reconcile what had just happened. He had believed in the perfection of logic and diplomacy, yet Ethan had just shown him that diplomacy was not always about making compromises or reaching agreements. It was sometimes about proving your strength when no other option existed. The professor took a slow, deliberate breath, his mind shifting from defense to acceptance. He could not deny the lesson he had just been forced to learn. Humanity's strength was not just in their intellect. It was in their ability to survive, to adapt to every new challenge, no matter how impossible it seemed. "I underestimated you," Xian admitted, his voice quieter now, the sharp edge of arrogance replaced with genuine humility. "I believed you humans were nothing but impulsive, reckless creatures. But I see now that I was wrong." Ethan nodded, acknowledging the professor's words, but he did not smile. His mission wasn't to gloat or to take satisfaction in Xian's defeat. It was about teaching the professor, and by extension, the entire galaxy, that humanity's strength lay not in conquering others, but in their unbreakable will to survive. As the class slowly began to stir, some students exchanged glances, while others seemed to reflect on the weight of what they had witnessed. Ethan's lesson had reached not just Xian, but every one of them. For the first time, the students saw humans not as flawed or weak, but as survivors, resilient, fierce, and capable of standing their ground in a galaxy that had often dismissed them. The lesson was clear. Survival wasn't something taught in books. It was something you lived through, and humanity had just proven it in the most striking way possible. The tension in the room had barely begun to dissipate. Professor Xian stood motionless, his mind racing as he processed the unexpected outcome of his confrontation with Ethan McAllister. The other students in the classroom, once filled with skepticism and amusement at the human's audacity, were now looking at Ethan in a new light. What had started as a simple lesson in diplomacy had turned into something far more profound, a confrontation between intellect and primal strength, between theory and the harsh reality of survival. Ethan's gaze never left Xian. His stance was still strong, but there was no triumph in his expression, only a quiet resolve. The sword was still in his hand, but it was no longer an instrument of aggression. It was a symbol of what he had shown the professor, humanity's ability to endure, to adapt, and, when necessary, to fight in order to survive. Xian, for all his years of knowledge and diplomacy, stood before Ethan in stunned silence. He had just been forced to confront an aspect of humanity that he had dismissed for so long: human resilience. In his years of teaching, Xian had always believed that true strength lay in the ability to resolve conflicts through reason and diplomacy. He had dismissed humanity's chaotic history, their wars and struggles, as evidence of weakness. But in this moment, he understood how wrong he had been. The Xerath species, a race known for their intellectual prowess and peaceful existence, had long believed that only the mind held true power. They had learned to coexist without conflict for centuries, mastering the art of negotiation and dialogue. They had believed that peace was the highest form of strength. But Xian's beliefs were now crumbling before him, shattered by the humans standing before him. Ethan's approach to survival was not just about fighting for the sake of power. It was about something deeper, something more primal. The human student had shown him that sometimes survival was a fight to maintain one's dignity, a fight to preserve what mattered most. It was not just about winning. It was about endurance and the ability to keep going, even when it seemed impossible. As Xian stood there, processing the events that had just unfolded, he realized that humanity's strength was not something to be ignored or belittled. It was something that needed to be understood. The lesson Ethan had imparted wasn't just about defeating an opponent. It was about recognizing that humanity's survival instinct was tied to something far more profound than just the desire to win. It was about resilience, a quality that could not be taught through books or theories. Xian took a slow, deliberate step back, his gaze still fixed on Ethan. The professor's pride, once so impenetrable, was now cracked, and for the first time, he found himself questioning his beliefs. The question that had once seemed so simple to him, why humans fought so often, now seemed far more complicated. It wasn't that humanity couldn't negotiate or seek peace. It was that peace had to be earned, and sometimes that meant proving you could survive without it. The alien professor finally spoke, his voice softer than before. "You're right, McAllister," he admitted, his words carrying the weight of humility. "I've spent my life teaching that peace is the ultimate strength, that reason and logic are all that is needed to end conflict. But you've shown me that strength doesn't always lie in the mind. It lies in the will to survive." Ethan nodded, lowering the sword but keeping his posture firm. "Survival isn't always about winning, Professor. Sometimes it's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to walk away. Sometimes it's about enduring what the universe throws at you and not giving up." Xion's multi-limbed body, once tense with arrogance, now appeared more grounded, his posture less defensive. He had seen the human side of Ethan, the part that wasn't about intellect or strategies, but about something much more fundamental: survival. The lesson was hard-won, but it was a lesson that would change his perception forever. Humanity wasn't just a chaotic species caught in a web of conflict. It was a species that had learned to adapt, to grow stronger, and to persevere, no matter the challenges. The alien students, who had been silent observers until now, slowly began to process what they had just witnessed. For some, this moment was a revelation. They had always considered humans beneath them, too emotional and unpredictable to be trusted with a delicate balance of intergalactic diplomacy. But now, the human student had shown them a different side of humanity, a side that didn't just rely on intellect, but on raw survival instincts, something even the most powerful alien races had forgotten in their pursuit of peace. Ethan's victory was not just physical. It was a triumph of spirit, a reminder that humanity's greatest strength was not found in diplomacy alone, but in the will to endure. Xion had learned that the next time he underestimated a human, it would not be because of their lack of intellect or skill. It would be because of their ability to survive and adapt, even when facing overwhelming odds. As the class slowly resumed, Ethan sat back down, the sword sheathed, his actions having spoken louder than any words could. Xion, still processing the gravity of the lesson, moved to the front of the class and addressed the students. "Today," he began, his voice steady but carrying an unfamiliar respect, "you've all witnessed something powerful. Not just a lesson in combat, but a lesson in survival." The shift in Xion's perspective was clear to everyone in the room. Ethan McAllister had not only changed the professor's view on humanity, but had altered the very fabric of how survival, strength, and peace would be understood in the galaxy going forward. It wasn't about defeating others. It was about knowing when to fight and when to survive. And for humans, that lesson was always learned the hard way. As the lesson came to a close, the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air. The classroom, which had once been a sanctuary for academic pursuits and intellectual debates, now felt like a place of transformation. The students, once indifferent or skeptical of the human in their midst, now looked at Ethan McAllister with a newfound respect. What they had witnessed wasn't just a clash of two individuals. It was a reflection of humanity's true strength and its place in the galactic community. Professor Xion, standing at the front of the room, had never felt more humbled. His years of academic superiority had failed to prepare him for the lesson that a single human student had just imparted. As he scanned the room, the professor's mind raced with the realization that humanity was not just a species that had struggled to survive. It was a species that had earned its place among the stars through sheer willpower. Humanity's power did not lie solely in its intellect or technology, but in its ability to adapt, endure, and survive against all odds. The lesson that Xion had learned was simple, yet profound. True strength is not just about power or intellect. It's about resilience. As the class began to disperse, the students filed out one by one, but their expressions were different. They were no longer looking down on the human among them. They were considering the deeper lesson he had taught them. Even the most advanced species, with their superior technology and intellect, could not fully grasp the human experience. Humanity's struggle, its history of violence, survival, and endurance, was something that no amount of diplomacy could explain away. It had to be witnessed. Ethan McAllister's eyes scanned the room once more, He wasn't a conqueror. He wasn't a warrior seeking glory. He was a survivor, a representation of humanity's most primal strength. He had stood up not just for himself, but for the legacy of his people. And in doing so, he had proven that humanity was far more than the stereotypes that plagued it. Xion's voice finally broke the silence, his tone more measured and reflective than ever. Today, we have all learned a powerful lesson, not just about diplomacy, but about the essence of survival. Humanity is not weak. It is not primitive. It is a force to be reckoned with. Ethan gave a slight nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, but he said nothing. Words weren't needed anymore. He had already proven his point. As he left the classroom, Ethan felt a quiet satisfaction. He had been pushed to the edge, but he had done more than just defend himself. He had shattered the preconceived notions about humanity that had held others back from seeing the truth. The galaxy had just learned that humans were not to be underestimated, and survival, the ability to adapt and overcome, was what truly defined their strength. The lesson wasn't just for Xion. It was for the entire galaxy. Humanity's greatest strength was not in their weapons or their minds. It was in their unwavering will to endure, to survive, and to rise, no matter the challenges they faced. That was a lesson that no amount of diplomacy could teach. It was a lesson earned through every hardship and every battle, and it would resonate across the stars for generations to come.